Deep in the rainforest that wraps around Cairns, something has been waiting for someone to explain it. Not metaphorically, not spiritually. Literally waiting, in stone and earth and carved rock, for the kind of answer that archaeology keeps promising and keeps failing to deliver. Cairns is known for the reef, for the Daintree, for backpackers eating cheap pad thai on the esplanade while planning their next dive. What it is not known for is being one of the most archaeologically contested regions in Australia, a place where the physical evidence on the ground has been quietly challenging the accepted version of Australian prehistory for decades. But that is exactly what it is. Within a few hours of the city, there are stone arrangements that predate any accepted timeline of organised construction in this part of the world. There are carvings on rock faces that do not match any documented Indigenous artistic tradition from the region. There are structures so precisely aligned to astronomical events that their placement cannot be explained by accident, and yet the people who built them left no written record, no oral tradition that has survived intact, and no tools at the site that would explain how the work was done. Some of these sites have been known to researchers for over a century. Others were only documented in the last decade. A few are still being argued about in academic papers that have not reached a consensus. What they share is a quality that most archaeological sites do not have. They resist the easy explanation. Every time someone produces a theory that seems to fit, another feature of the same site refuses to cooperate. This video examines 10 of them. Not myths, not internet speculation. Sites with documented physical evidence, credible researchers who have spent serious time investigating them, and questions that, as of right now, remain genuinely open. If this kind of content interests you, subscribe now. We cover the unexplained corners of Australia that most channels never get to. Hit the notification bell and you will not miss what is coming next. Let us begin. Structure 1. The Atherton tableland stone arrangements. Drive an hour southwest of Cairns and the landscape shifts. The coastal lowlands give way to the edge of the tablelands, a high volcanic plateau sitting between 500 and 900 meters above sea level. The rainforest thickens, the temperature drops, and scattered across properties and protected crown land throughout this region are stone arrangements that have been puzzling researchers since European settlers first documented them in the 19th century. The arrangements are not random scatterings of loose rock, they are deliberate. Lines of basalt stones extending for distances up to 40 meters. Circular formations with measurable diameters. Groupings that appear to mark points of astronomical significance when their orientation is plotted against the sky. The volcanic basalt that makes up these arrangements is the same rock that forms the tablelands plateau itself. The stones were not transported from elsewhere. They were selected and placed in specific configurations by people who clearly understood something about geometry and potentially about celestial observation. What remains unexplained is not simply who built them. The local Ngadjonji and Mbarbaram peoples have connection to this country, and some oral traditions reference stone formations in general terms. What researchers cannot establish with confidence is when the existing arrangements were constructed, what specific purpose each configuration served, and whether the astronomical alignments that have been measured are intentional or the product of retrospective pattern recognition. A 2009 study by a team from James Cook University examined several of the Atherton formations and concluded that the astronomical alignments were statistically improbable as accidents. That finding has been disputed, defended, and disputed again in subsequent literature without resolution. The stones remain. The argument continues. Structure 2. The Daintree River petroglyphs. North of Cairns, past Port Douglas, the road narrows and the canopy closes in overhead until the Daintree rainforest absorbs everything around you completely. This is the oldest continuously surviving tropical rainforest on the planet, predating the Amazon by tens of millions of years. The Wet Tropics World Heritage Area covers roughly 9,000 square kilometres of terrain that has remained fundamentally unchanged since before humans arrived on this continent. Within the Daintree, on rock surfaces near the river system, there are petroglyphs, carved images in stone that have been documented by researchers, but whose origin and meaning remain contested. The problem is not that petroglyphs exist. Rock art is found throughout Australia in varying styles and periods, and the Quincan rock art sites at Laura, a few hours to the northwest, are among the most extensively documented and genuinely extraordinary collections of Indigenous art anywhere in the world. The Daintree petroglyphs are different in character. The style of some of the carvings does not match the regional traditions documented at Laura or at sites across Cape York. Some feature geometric patterns that appear more consistent with styles found thousands of kilometres away, while others include forms that have no clear parallel in any documented Australian tradition. The age of the carvings is difficult to establish with precision because the technique used to date them requires material that was not consistently deposited. Some estimates, based on weathering and relative stratigraphy, suggest extreme antiquity. Others are more conservative. What no researcher has been able to satisfactorily explain is the stylistic divergence. If the petroglyphs were made by the communities documented as connected to this country, why do some of them look so unlike the established artistic traditions of those communities? If they were made by someone else, who was working with stone tools in the Daintree rainforest, and when? Structure 3. The Barron Gorge Wall Formations. 25 kilometres west of Cairns, the Barron River has been cutting through ancient granite country for millions of years. The gorge it has created is steep, dramatic, and accessible by the Kuranda Scenic Railway, which is how most visitors experience it. But the railway tourists are looking at the water and the vegetation. The people who have been looking at the walls have found something that the railway does not stop to show you. Along sections of the gorge walls, particularly on the southern face in areas accessible only on foot, there are formations that have generated serious disagreement about whether they are natural or constructed. The formations consist of flat-faced granite sections arranged in what appear to be deliberate horizontal and vertical patterns. Where natural granite weathering typically produces irregular fracture planes and rounded surfaces, these sections present faces that are measurably more regular than surrounding rock. The natural explanation centers on the granite's jointing patterns. Granite fractures along predictable planes determined by the cooling history of the rock, and it is possible, proponents of the natural explanation argue, for erosion to expose these joints in ways that look artificial without being so. The problem with that explanation is scale. The regularity extends across sections of wall too large and too consistent to be easily attributed to natural jointing alone. A geologist who examined the site in 2017 described the formations as, quote, not inconsistent with natural processes, but not easily explained by them either. That assessment has not been superseded by anything more definitive. Whether someone shaped these walls or the gorge produced them without assistance, the visual effect is striking, and the question of which explanation is correct remains technically open. Structure 4. The Undara Lava Tube Modifications. 300 kilometres southwest of Cairns, the Undara Volcanic National Park protects one of the most significant lava tube systems in the world. The tubes were formed around 190,000 years ago when surface lava flows crusted over while still molten inside, eventually draining to leave hollow tunnels extending for enormous distances underground. Some individual tubes run for more than 100 metres in width and height. The tubes themselves are a natural phenomenon. The question is whether they were always purely natural or whether they were modified. In several accessible sections of the Undara system, researchers have documented evidence of deliberate alteration at the tube entrances. Collapsed sections appear to have been cleared. Entry points show signs of grading that does not match the slumped and random profiles expected from natural collapse alone. In at least 2 documented cases, stone has been moved from inside the tube to positions outside it in patterns that suggest purposeful placement rather than geological displacement. The Gugu Badhun people have deep connections to this country and have confirmed that the lava tubes were used historically for shelter, ceremony, and as a known resource in a landscape of extreme heat and limited shade. That connection is documented and not in question. What is in question is the extent of modification and the period over which it occurred. The evidence for clearing and shaping at certain tube entrances suggests organised labour operating with a purpose beyond simple, opportunistic shelter use. The full picture of that activity has not been reconstructed. Structure 5. The Goldsborough Valley terracing. 12 kilometres south of Cairns, the Mulgrave River runs through a valley flanked by steep rainforest slopes. The Goldsborough Valley is a popular recreational area with walking tracks and swimming holes that attract locals on weekends. The terrace formations visible on the valley slopes attract considerably less attention, partly because they require a specific angle and light condition to be clearly visible, and partly because their explanation remains unresolved enough that they do not appear in official park interpretation materials. The terraces are horizontal platforms cut into the slope in patterns consistent with agricultural modification. The slope gradient in the areas where terracing appears is steep enough that unmodified hillside would not support cultivation. The terrace forms break the slope into flatter sections that could retain soil and moisture. The immediate inference that these terraces were created for agricultural purposes generates more questions than it answers. There is no confirmed oral tradition specifically describing intensive hillside cultivation in this valley. The scale of terracing, if the visible formations are indeed anthropogenic, and if they extend across the full area where similar forms appear, would represent a level of organised agricultural infrastructure not consistent with the conventional understanding of pre-contact land use in this region. Researchers who have examined the terraces have not reached agreement on whether they are natural or constructed. Geological processes can produce bench-like formations on certain slope types under specific conditions. The counter-argument is that the formations in Goldsborough Valley appear in configurations and at intervals more consistent with deliberate spacing than with geological self-organisation. This one is genuinely not resolved. It may have a natural explanation. It may not. Structure 6. The Cape Tribulation coastal alignments. North of the Daintree ferry crossing, the road runs along a narrow coastal strip where the rainforest comes down almost to the beach. Cape Tribulation is the point where 2 World Heritage listed environments, the wet tropics rainforest and the Great Barrier Reef, meet in the same geographical space. It is also the location of a coastal rock formation that has been periodically studied and consistently argued about since the 1980s. On the foreshore near the Cape, a series of large rocks sits in an arrangement that, when examined from above, describes an alignment pointing toward a specific position on the eastern horizon. That position corresponds to the sunrise point at the summer solstice. The alignment is not perfect. It is close enough that researchers attempting to demonstrate its deliberate nature have argued it falls within acceptable error margins for construction without precision instruments. Critics have argued it does not. The rocks themselves are substantial. Their current position may or may not reflect their original placement, given the dynamic nature of a tropical foreshore subject to cyclone impacts, tidal surge, and vegetation change over long periods. That contextual uncertainty complicates any attempt to establish whether the alignment was created or is a product of selective perception applied to a natural arrangement. What makes Cape Tribulation worth including in any honest list of this kind is not that the case for deliberate construction is overwhelming. It is not. It is that enough independent researchers examining the same site have arrived at similar observations about the orientation that dismissing the alignment entirely requires more confidence than the physical evidence supports. Structure 7. The Kuranda ceremonial platform. In the ranges above Cairns, in a section of rainforest accessible by a track that requires some effort to locate, there is a flat stone platform measuring approximately 12 meters by 8 meters. The surface is formed from closely fitted stones of varying sizes, and the overall level achieved is measurably more consistent than the surrounding terrain would produce without deliberate preparation. The platform was documented by a local researcher in 2004 and subsequently examined by 2 separate teams over the following decade. The examination produced findings that the teams have interpreted differently. The first team concluded that the platform showed clear evidence of intentional construction, citing the degree of levelness achieved, the selection of flat stones used on the surface, and the presence of what appeared to be a deliberate edge treatment on the northern and western sides. The second team was more cautious, noting that the basaltic geology of the ranges produces naturally flat-surfaced rock in certain contexts, and that the level achieved could reflect natural deposition rather than deliberate grading. Both teams agreed on one thing. The platform is unusual. Its dimensions, its regularity, and its location on a ridgeline with broad views to the east place it in a context that invites interpretation without supplying confirmation. No oral tradition has been brought forward that specifically describes this location as a known ceremonial site, though the absence of that documentation does not establish that no such tradition exists. The platform continues to be visited by researchers who have not yet agreed on what it is. Structure 8. The Tablelands Grinding Grooves Complex. Throughout the Atherton tablelands, grinding grooves have been documented at numerous sites. Grinding grooves are elongated depressions worn into rock surfaces by the repeated sharpening of stone tools, and they appear widely across Australia as evidence of long-term site occupation. By themselves, they are not unusual. What is unusual at one complex of sites in the central tablelands is the scale and the configuration. Individual grinding grooves at this complex are among the largest documented in Queensland, with some examples measuring over 1 metre in length and more than 30 centimetres in depth. That scale implies a volume of use far beyond what would be expected for routine tool maintenance. More significantly, the grooves at this complex appear in configurations that suggest spatial organisation rather than opportunistic use of convenient rock surfaces. The grooves are grouped in patterns that repeat across multiple adjacent rock surfaces in ways that imply a planned arrangement. The spacing between groups is consistent. The orientation of the grooves within each group follows a common axis. No explanation has been offered for why grinding grooves would be deliberately arranged in spatial patterns. The standard interpretation of grinding grooves as purely functional, people sharpening tools at a convenient rock, does not account for the deliberate organisation visible at this complex. A more recent interpretive framework has proposed that the complex served a social or ceremonial function, with the act of grinding itself being the ritual and the grooves recording accumulated participation over long periods. That interpretation has not been universally accepted, but it has also not been convincingly refuted by an alternative account. Structure 9. The Walsh River Stone Circle. West of Mariba, on the western slopes of the Great Dividing Range, where the landscape opens out from rainforest into dry eucalypt savanna, the Walsh River runs through cattle country and largely undocumented archaeological territory. In this area, a stone circle was recorded in a survey conducted in the early 1990s and has been the subject of intermittent study since. The circle consists of upright stones, some standing to a height of around 60 centimeters, arranged in a roughly circular pattern with a diameter of approximately 15 meters. The stones are not uniform in size or shape, but their upright orientation is consistent around the formation, and the general circularity of the arrangement is maintained despite individual variations in placement. Stone circles are not commonly documented in Australia. They appear in the archaeological record at specific locations, but they are not characteristic of the wider Australian rock art and stone arrangement tradition in the way that they are characteristic of, for instance, parts of Europe or the Middle East. The Walsh River circle is therefore somewhat anomalous in its regional context. Attempts to date the formation through luminescence techniques applied to sediment samples associated with the base of upright stones have produced results ranging from several hundred to several thousand years before present, a range too wide to be useful for interpretation. The cultural context has not been established through any confirmed oral tradition, and the formation sits on pastoral land where access for sustained research has been limited by the requirements of landowners. What it is, precisely, remains an open question. Structure 10. The Cairns hinterland earthworks. In the cleared farming land and remnant vegetation of the immediate Cairns hinterland, particularly in areas to the south and west of the city where broad-acre agriculture has been practiced since the late 19th century, there are earthwork formations that were documented during aerial survey work conducted in the 1970s and have been examined with increasing interest since satellite and drone photography became accessible. The formations are low earthen ridges and shallow channels arranged in geometric patterns across the landscape. They are subtle, visible clearly only from the air or in low light conditions that cast long shadows. From ground level, in most conditions, they are nearly invisible. They were almost certainly ploughed through and partially destroyed across much of their original extent during the agricultural clearing of the 19th and 20th centuries. What remains are fragments, but those fragments repeat a pattern consistent enough that the original extent of the formations can be estimated with some confidence. The closest parallel in Australia to these kinds of subtle earthwork formations are the fish trap systems and aquaculture infrastructure documented in Western Victoria, most famously at Budge Bim, where the Gunditjmara people constructed an elaborate eel farming system from stone that was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List in 2019. The Budge Bim complex demonstrated that pre-contact Australian communities were capable of large-scale, organised landscape modification for food production purposes. The Cairns hinterland formations could represent something similar. They could be drainage channels from early European farming activity. They could be a combination of both, with later activity obscuring earlier patterns. What no analysis has yet established is a definitive origin, a confirmed function, or a timeline for the construction of what can be clearly identified as patterned earthwork in the landscape surrounding one of Australia's major tourist cities. That ambiguity is the honest conclusion, not a solved mystery, not a confirmed ancient civilization, a set of physical features in the landscape that the available evidence cannot yet fully explain, sitting in plain sight in a region most visitors pass through on their way to somewhere else entirely. The 10 sites examined in this video do not resolve into a single narrative. They do not collectively prove any particular theory about the deep history of this region. What they do is demonstrate that the accepted account of pre-contact North Queensland is less complete than it is sometimes presented as being. Archaeology is an ongoing process. New techniques for dating, new methods of landscape analysis, and new frameworks for interpretation are changing what can be known about the past at a rate that makes conclusions reached a decade ago regularly worth revisiting. Several of the sites on this list are the subject of current research that has not yet produced published findings. The conclusions, when they arrive, may resolve some of these questions. They may open new ones. What is established is that the physical evidence exists. These structures, these formations, these arrangements and carvings and earthworks are there. They have been examined by credentialed researchers using sound methodologies. The questions raised by that examination are not fringe speculation. They are documented uncertainty, which is a different thing and a more interesting one. The question worth carrying away from this is not which conspiracy explains the gap. The more productive question is what these sites suggest about what systematic historical inquiry in North Queensland still has left to find, in a region where the forest has been covering the ground for longer than most of human recorded history. If you found this worthwhile, subscribe and stay with this channel. The next video examines something equally strange and equally close to home. And if you have spent time around any of these sites or know something about them that did not make it into this video, the comment section is exactly the right place for that conversation. We read everyone. See you in the next one.